Well, thank you so much for coming out. My name is Daniel. I'm on the Richmond Conservation Office. Good to see you all. There is in the back a handout which has the questions that we'll be asking for tonight, as well as the names of our panelists, which you can get to know in the next hour plus. So make sure you use that and fill out whatever information is back there. We have an amazing panel tonight, and we're extremely appreciative and grateful that they were able to travel from all over Vermont to be here to talk with us and to share their knowledge and their expertise. Also, a big thank you to Jim for moderating this panel. We really appreciate that. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jim. But welcome, and thanks so much for coming.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. I'm not going to use a mic, but we're going to have a mic for the panelists, for folks in the room. So welcome, everybody, to tonight's panel discussion on balancing conservation and trails-based recreation, hosted by the Richmond Conservation Commission. A great group and a great topic tonight. I want to thank the Conservation Commission for giving me the opportunity to moderate tonight's panel of experts. I also want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Abenaki, who have lived here for generations, and we are hosting this event on their unceded lands.
Can we do a quick timeout? We're having virtual participants having a hard time. Could you try the mic?
Yeah, I can definitely try the mic,
cool.
yes.
And same thing for
That's
other
great.
speakers.
So,
that gives us a little more boost in this.
Absolutely. This work? Oh, is it? Okay. How's that? Okay. This is pretty cool, right? For the last couple of years, we've been doing everything on Zoom, so we're all starting to remember how to do mics and in-person things, so bear with us here. Before our panelists introduce themselves, I want to say a few words about the format of tonight's discussion. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little introductions. We're going to take about an hour. We have like 12 questions that were synthesized from a whole bunch of questions that came in from community members. It's great to see that input coming in early. And so we have 12 questions, which gives us about 5 minutes per question. We'll kind of play it by ear how it lays out. Then we're going to take a 10-minute break, stretch our legs, and then we're going to reconvene. We're going to take questions from the audience. We have an audience here in the library here in Richmond, and then we also have an audience assembling from around the globe on Zoom. And so we're going to take questions. We'll alternate back and forth so that the folks that are joining us remotely through Zoom have an opportunity to weigh in. And Daniel's going to be handling that, the moderating of the questions from Zoom. So we'll alternate back and forth. So my role tonight is to facilitate a conversation. And I want to recognize that I'm a male up here, so I'm going to really try not to mansplain anything tonight. So my role is just to, as I was describing a little bit earlier, try to be the air traffic control and kind of keep the questions moving along, keep the conversation going. So Richmond is not in a unique position wrestling with this issue of how you balance conservation and recreation, the people uses of our lands. Communities across the country are facing this. Everything, you don't have to go very far to open up the New York Times, The Guardian in England, to see communities like Moab, Jackson, Wyoming, and even East Burke showed up in an article in the New York Times, and or even opening up a Patagonia catalog and seeing them have a conversation about how lands are used in the context of recreation. So it's out there. In my day job at the Nature Conservancy, where we work to protect the lands and waters that help sustain the life on Earth, here in Vermont, we own about 32,000 acres, and on those fee lands that we hold, we encounter this conversation all the time. Where do you place trails that accommodate people as well as not degrade the natural resources there that for why those lands were protected. So that's why I was really excited to be the moderator tonight, because this is a conversation we're having in-house at the Nature Conservancy within our staff and among our members. So I'm really hoping to learn a lot from our group tonight. As we work to address climate change and a biodiversity loss crisis globally, we know that conserving natural lands can be a part of the solution, indeed needs to be part of the solution, and that people need to be part of that solution as well. If people don't care about the lands and connect with the lands, they won't necessarily engage in the long-term conservation of those. So really that we have a need to have folks appreciate the lands, enjoy those, and also protect those lands and conserve them so that we can address those crises. And then I also want to acknowledge that a lot of conservation over the last 50, 60, or even 100 years has been done in an unequitable way. It's been done in a way that hasn't really engaged communities fairly. And this is an opportunity for us as the community of Richmond to start thinking about how we can do equitable conservation to provide access to lands that maybe people that have been marginalized or don't have that opportunity to access lands have, create those opportunities. So I feel really fortunate that I live in this community and that we have places like the Andrews Forest and the Preston Woods behind my house and the neighboring lands around them. So great resources and a great conversation tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. I'm going to start maybe with you, Andrea, and then we'll work our way down, just do a quick introduction and maybe where you're from, maybe your role when you're not here, and then maybe just a little bit about yourself.
Okay, do I need to?
Absolutely.
So the virtual audience is having a hard time hearing, so if you can hold the mobile mic closer to your mouth, that might help.
Okay,
Stuff.
got
Sorry
it.
about that.
Thank you.
I got into wildlife, so I didn't have to do this sort of thing. My name's Andrea. I'm a wildlife biologist for the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Vermont. I live in Essex Junction, and my office is down in Barre, but I work all over the state with private landowners and consulting foresters trying to improve wildlife habitat and healthy forests throughout the state. I've done that role for about 6 years. Previous to that, I was working out west for the Forest Service as a wildland firefighter and a wildlife biologist in a couple different states, but really happy to be back in Vermont. I grew up here and my family's here, so it's a place that's near and dear to my heart. Spent a lot of time recently on the Andrews Forest, both as a trail user and as a hunter, so I'm very familiar with kind of the complexities out there.
Hi everyone. My name is Claire Pulfus. I serve as the Recreation Program Manager for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation here in Vermont. I'm relatively new to this position. I started in November. Before that, I've had 10 years of experience in recreation management, working for a mapping company and working for the Appalachian Trail in Maine. Before that, I was a graduate of the Field Naturalist and Ecological Planning program here at UVM, and during that time I actually lived here in Richmond. So I'm a former resident and think back on it very fondly and all of the adventures that I had here. So thank you for having me. I currently live in the Northeast Kingdom and am based in Montpelier working on statewide recreation issues.
My name is Meredith Naughton. I am currently a wildlife biologist for the Green Mountain National Forest, for the Forest Service there, serving in the mostly central southern part of the state, as you might be familiar with, and had the pleasure and opportunity to be in the right place at the right time and get to work as part of the Field Naturalist program on this big question of the interaction between recreation trails and wildlife. I needed a project, Fish and Wildlife and Forest Parks and Rec needed some answers, and I got to dig in and do that research. So that was such a great opportunity. I learned a lot. I also was part of the Field Naturalist Master's Program team that did the inventory, analysis, and assessment of the Andrews Community Forest here in 2018, and loved getting familiar with that forest and have since visited a lot. I'm a resident of Montpelier, and prior to those experiences moved to Vermont about 10 or 11 years ago and have worked in a variety of environmental and conservation nonprofits around the state since then. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah Epstein. I'm the Stewardship Director at Northeast Wilderness Trust, which is a regional land trust focused on conserving land as forever wild. So by that, we mean nature directs the ebb and flow of life and human intervention is pretty minimal. We take an ecocentric view to our approach to conservation. So Northeast Wilderness Trust works in New England and northern New York, and we safeguard over 76,000 acres both in wilderness preserves that we own and manage, and also by holding conservation easements. And our office is in Montpelier, Vermont. We safeguard about 15,000 acres in Vermont, and I live in Montpelier as well. I've been with the Wilderness Trust for almost 2 years now, and prior to that worked for a couple other land trusts as well as the National Park Service. And yeah, I'm excited to dig into the questions here.
All right, so pass the mic down to this end of the table here. I may have to start to do the Oprah thing and just wander around the mic. So, all right, so here we go with our panel discussion. We're right on time. Well done. So we have 12 questions, and so I'm going to start with the first one here. So really, the question is about defining conservation and recreation, so sort of set the grounds for the context of the conversation. So our discussion is centered around balancing conservation and trail-based recreation. So how do we define conservation, and how do we define, or can you provide examples of trail-based recreation? And Andrea was nice enough to agree to go first here in this rather weighty first question.
Really diving into them. I think we probably have about 8 different definitions of conservation among the 4 of us here. So I'll just speak in the context in which I work in, and that's on private lands here in Vermont. And to me, I think conservation, really highlights keeping an ecologically functional landscape, a working landscape that is available for wildlife connectivity, for people to enjoy, and to preserve or conserve, I should say, into the future. So I guess I'll start with that definition and pass it along. If anyone else wants to say anything.
Great. I would say I agree with Andrea, so we don't have different definitions. That's great. I think I would add that thinking of this as a scale where there's one side that's recreation and one side that's conservation is generally a false dichotomy for most land management decisions. Most land management decisions we make are based on balancing many uses and looking at each parcel to see where the highest and best use of the parcel, whether it's by humans or by animals or by plants. I'm not saying it's all about human use, but it's about looking at the many different aspects of the property or the landscape and deciding where and when different things can happen. So it's not like the scale, the Libra scale, it's like a very amorphous system of the ecosystem and the social system as well.
I agree with what both Claire and Andrea said. Great summaries. So you might be the better one to take the stab at the next part of the question to provide examples of trail-based recreation or define that. But how I've defined that, because it can kind of start one thing leading to another, what about this, what about that? In general, the way, when I'm thinking about trail-based recreation, I think about something that's happening on an intentionally built and linear path. So that would be motorized recreation, like any type of off-highway vehicle use, snowmobiles or ATVs, all seasons of foot travel, skiing, biking, so many different things. I feel like recreation will continue to evolve as long as we're alive. And doing it on an intentionally sited and created trail is what I've spent the most time thinking about. And I think what we're talking about primarily tonight, backcountry skiing is something that often comes up as a gray area. And it might just live in that gray zone. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but just to start to bring up some of the nuances of this incredibly complicated question that we have of how do these two resources or two values interact? Like a backcountry glade, for example, is not an intentionally built structure, but it would be a concentration of people in a certain way. But it acts a little bit different than the way a built structure does. So generally when I'm talking about it, I'm not going into that gray area, just to have a little bit of confines, not that that isn't also worth consideration and attention. Sure.
I think I'll also just add, I like to think about conservation really as an umbrella. And depending on, the entity, whether it's a town, a conservation commission, a land trust, we all kind of have these different focus areas under the big umbrella of conservation. And there's no one focus that is right or is what should be most focused on. I think it's important to have a whole landscape of different approaches to conservation across our natural landscape.
Thanks. Awesome start to the questions here. So Meredith, I'm going to pitch this one your way, the next one here. I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but your comment about backcountry skiing actually made me think about, the question is, how does trail-based recreation impact both negative and positive ways natural communities? And the reason I was sort of triggered thinking about your comment about backcountry skiing is that it's not necessarily like on a defined path or a trail that's been built, but it is bringing a concentration of people into a natural community that may have an impact. And so maybe I was wondering if maybe you could riff on that a little bit and maybe use that as an opening to answer this question, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'm gathering my thoughts. This is a big question. So how does trail-based recreation impact in both negative and positive ways natural communities? I have thought about this mostly from the context of wildlife, but I think as starting, it's important also to mention that plants and soils are a big part of our natural communities as well that can be altered or changed by trail-based recreation. So the way that these are changed, well, it's anytime you're adding a variable into a system, it changes. So when people go into the woods, it changes. When one person walks through the woods, it's a really temporary new variable that doesn't repeat necessarily. And I think that that's one thing too about trail-based recreation versus other types of dispersed recreation. We have botanists or hunters or someone who's not taking the exact same path year after year, day after day. And some of the negative ways that I've learned this interaction happens is, I guess this is getting onto the next one a little bit, and Jim, stop me if I'm going in the wrong direction, but there's small scale effects, like there might be some plant trampling on the side of a trail, or erosion may occur based on changes in hydrology, or individual animals may startle or flee or leave their food or nest or something like that based on one small interaction. But those do build over time and can slowly change the ecological function that Andrea mentioned earlier, as the hydrology may change, the way the water moves through the soil, the health or function of the soil on the trail tread. Trails also may introduce, or they may be proxies for introducing non-native invasive plant species or pathogens. I've heard of fungus pathogens being on mountain bike tires, and you mountain bike in Colorado, and then you come to Vermont and you mountain bike, and you can move things around that way, in addition to seeds. And with wildlife, those effects that I mentioned earlier can be cumulative at maybe the vertebrate scale. And at the invertebrate scale, it can really dissect a community where there's an example of a study that an invertebrate community on one side of a trail was entirely different than the invertebrate community on another side of a trail. However, there are also positive effects of natural communities. I guess positive effects of trails, which we're all very familiar with. And I think, to be honest, I didn't have a prepared answer on a positive effect on natural communities of trails. And so I'd like to open that up to other folks, but just mention, we're all well aware of the positive effects of trails on our own individual lives, on the lives of everyone surviving the pandemic, needing to get outside, connection with nature, and nurturing a relationship with the outdoor world so that we grow up and grow more important land stewards and conservationists. Yeah, does anyone else have something to add on the?
Claire, I was wondering, do you want to, from your role at the Forests and Parks, you delve in this a lot, like that human impact there. And so I don't know if you wanted to add any, and feel free to drift into number 3 if you want to do that.
I think that one of the ways to look at this is at different scales and different time periods. So generally, as Meredith said, it's hard to think of a positive impact, say, to a natural community of a new trail, but there's a documented positive impact in the long term of people getting outside and protecting natural communities. So we're kind of thinking of these impacts at different scales and time periods, and so it's hard to compare them. It's one of the tricky, nuanced things about this whole conversation. I think one of the things to think about is if you think of the town of Richmond, there are places that are more wild and there are places that are less wild. But those places are connected and they're all part of the same system. We often think of the outdoors as something other than where we live. But where we live is part of the same system that the woods are part of, that the mountaintops are part of, that our homes are part of. And we all are thinking about what impact we have on all of those parts of our system. And so when you're thinking about a person going out in the woods, for example, we're impacting everything around us just like we are when we're going out in our communities. And I think many people, including FPR, believes that people do belong in the woods too, that access to the outdoors is really important, and that it's not necessarily not part of the same system that our communities are part of. So I think that's something to think about. When we think of natural communities, we certainly want to protect sensitive species. We want to ensure the ecological function that Andrea mentioned of the whole community, but that whole community includes people as well. And trails are a way that we manage that use. In terms of the third question, the research out there is growing, and that's how science works. We know more and more and more, and we can make better and better decisions. Science research on population scale and over long time periods is really expensive and hasn't really fully been invested in, is starting to be invested in. And as recreation managers, as wildlife managers, we are watching this. We are looking for these studies coming out from our academic partners, and we're making decisions based on the best available science that's there now. We know that recreation does have impacts on wildlife. We know what type of wildlife are most impacted, what species are most sensitive. We know what species are having the hardest time right now with the cumulative impacts of climate change, of development, of pollution. And so we have a lot more resources now than we did 10 years ago, than we did 20 years ago. And we have to take all those resources together and make the best possible decisions we can make right now. So hopefully in 10 years, if we have another panel like that, we'll be able to answer the population level impacts question a little bit better. But with the information we have right now, we have to make the best decisions we can make.
You want to answer? Did you?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just continue into the third question. Even though that maybe the magnitude of the impacts aren't well understood, we do know that density and disturbance is a huge factor on trails in wildlife. And we also know that trailless areas are a finite resource. And once you put a trail in an area, you can't take it out. So I think sometimes being really conservative in planning and in putting recreation in different areas is probably a better approach, even if we don't necessarily know the definitive impacts. I think we've seen, a lot of studies have seen that it's not the trail necessarily itself, it's the use and bringing people farther into the woods for more times of the day, more times of the year, is just kind of a cumulative density impact. So I just think that's something to think about. And balancing, the benefits of public access, there's huge benefits of getting people out and being able to appreciate what we have here. But we also need to consider, the other benefits that the forests are providing us, even town forests providing us with clean water and clean air, and just the intrinsic value of having these unfragmented landscapes. And you think about Chittenden County, and especially where we are right now, we're right in this kind of transition between Lake Champlain and into the mountains. And where we sit right here is this huge, beautiful forest block that connects Mount Mansfield and Camel's Hump and gets you all the way into the Northeast Kingdom. So this is a really valuable place to be very thoughtful about fragmentation and how wildlife and plants will be moving back and forth into the future. And so I think that's a really important thing to balance with public access.
Any more thoughts on question number 3? Okay. So I think we started talking about the impact now. So the question number 4 is recreation can refer to a wide variety of activities, right? Dog walking, hunting, running, birding, mountain biking, etc. What types of recreation have the highest impact, and how might we regulate regulation in order to minimize impact? And Hannah, I was wondering if you wanted to take a crack at that to start with.
Thank you. So I can, sort of answering the last part of that question, how might we regulate recreation in order to minimize impact, I can answer that in the context of my work and how Northeast Wilderness Trust approaches this. As I said, our organization's focus is really an ecocentric one. We try to think about our management actions or lack of management actions to be in service to nature for its own sake first, and for humans sort of as a secondary goal. That being said, obviously, as everyone has stated, human connection to nature is really important and helps, provide health benefits, but then also more support for conservation. And so the way that the Wilderness Trust balances this is by limiting certain types of recreation and being thoughtful about where that recreation takes place on our preserves. So all of our preserves are open to the public, but very few have an actual formalized trail or access point. So we sort of focus on trails, on preserves that have a bit easier public access, are less remote, maybe have former logging roads that can be turned into hiking trails, so it's already an impacted corridor on the landscape, and then trying to concentrate where that trail is, and then leave largely the rest of the property without formal recreation access. And then for, as far as types of recreation, we limit that to muscle-powered forms of recreation. So walking, hiking, nature and wildlife observation, skiing, snowshoeing, but we don't allow any motorized or mechanized recreation on our preserves. And that's not to say that those aren't fantastic forms of recreation in other places, but we have a really narrow mission and really stick to a certain niche to sort of fulfill the need for places that are less impacted by human influence on the landscape. So that's just, that's one example of the way one organization approaches this balance. And then it's important to think about in the context of all other, landowners and land uses across a landscape.
So I get the sense from this question that people are really looking for that, like, what's the scale from nuclear bad to no impact? And so I'm wondering if any one of you want to weigh in on sort of what's your sense of the relative impact of kind of common trail activities that we experience a lot in community forests or in Vermont towns? Yeah, go for it.
So I think first Hannah touched on something that I wanted to clarify also, that she mentioned that the New England Wilderness Trust often leaves their preserves trailless. And I mentioned this earlier, but it is the linear repeated concentration of disturbance that is the impactful force, mostly, of trails. And so that leaving trailless certainly doesn't invite everyone. We'll get later to thinking about equity as an important piece of trail planning, but that structure and repeated in the same place is kind of an important variable. And in terms of the types of recreation, this question comes up a lot. I think it's a really good question, and there's not a really good answer. In general, you can divide recreation in a lot of different ways. There's a machine involved or not, like walking versus biking. There's a motor involved or not. There's a dog involved or not. So those are a couple of important variables. And generally, as far as the research shows right now, there are not significant differences between walking and biking and skiing as forms of recreation. Those are all similarly observed. However, I should note there are also not a lot of comparative studies out there that are in the same place, looking at the same animals, comparing different types of recreation. So looking at biking in New York or snowshoeing in Quebec, birds versus coyotes, you can't quite draw comparative findings from that. There are a couple of solid conclusions that the realm of recreation ecology has held on to that I'll note come from really only a few papers, but they are strong conclusions, that motorized recreation has less of an impact than non-motorized recreation. And I'd like to explain that a little bit because it sometimes alarms people, but if you think about being in a car and driving by like a crow on the side of the road, or even if you've seen a moose on the side of the highway, it sort of just stays there, and you go by and it goes about its way. And motorized recreation generally is really short exposure time for any wildlife that is being disturbed by it, whereas a hiker at the other end is kind of slow and erratic, and you might stop and tie your shoe or look at your phone or take a picture and then keep going, or like laugh out loud with your friend. It's more erratic, it's a longer exposure time. But I'll note that what hasn't been considered there is the extent of recreation. Someone on a snowmobile might go farther than someone on foot. So I don't know that should be really held on to as something that should be managed around. That is a decision that maybe is more appropriately culturally managed. Would you like this to be a motorized trail or not? Dog walking has been researched quite a bit, and dogs are the number one disruptors of the forest when it comes to trails. And I say that as a person who ran on trails in Montpelier with my dog every single day of doing this research. It was like my lifeline. So I'm lover of dogs, lover of trails. But having a dog at all in the woods is more disruptive to wildlife. Having a dog off leash in the woods is another magnitude more disruptive to wildlife. I love having my dog off leash also, so it's, dogs and leashes are a whole other can of worms, but one way to regulate is to have a leash law. In the world of social science, it's been studied that if you have a leash law, it's moderately effective for having people keep their dogs on leashes. So I think that's one thing that I would suggest if you're looking for small ways to regulate the impact. For some places that doesn't make sense, if it's an area that isn't frequented very much, it's going to be a place where people go so they can walk their dogs off leash. So there's many layers of nuance to these decisions. But I hope that cleared up some of the confusion about different types of recreation having different impacts. And my personal thought is that, I'll say again, those should be, maybe cultural decisions because there isn't good science to say there's differences between different types of recreation.
Great.
I have one thing.
Yes.
I just want to add that lumping all wildlife or lumping all natural resources into one and saying which recreation type impacts it the most is impossible. Not only is it not backed up by the science, it's just not ever going to be, because not only do different wildlife species react differently to recreation, different wildlife individuals react differently to recreation, and the different types and the studies that have been done, like whether it's motorized and non-motorized, looked at a certain type of impact on the wildlife, but maybe didn't look at what the impact of the trail on salamanders was. And a wider trail might have a higher impact on salamanders, even if the use of the trail has less of an impact on moose. So just lumping all of it together is false, and why we need to look towards the species we know are at risk and try to protect those species when thinking, and systems, natural communities, rare species, or sensitive natural communities and species, because there's so much variability with those impacts.
Thanks. So I'm going to toss this one right back at you, Claire. Thanks for that. So the next one is, and we've sort of touched on this, I think all of you in your comments around the volume of recreation. And the impact of trail-based recreation depends on the numbers of humans using the trail. We heard that from all of you. How can carrying capacity of a trail be established? And how do we manage for the potential growth in the volume of users? So do you want to take a stab at that first, and then please, any one of you, jump in.
Like with all of these questions, it depends. So you're not going to get a straight answer from me, sorry. A carrying capacity for a trail is often different than the trail infrastructure around it. For example, a 3-mile trail can accommodate a certain number of users per hour and keep the same feel for the recreation, the hiker, the biker, the snowmobiler. But that parking lot can only accommodate how many cars that parking lot can accommodate. So generally, we run into issues of capacity at the infrastructure first. So that's Parking lots, campsites, if it's a backcountry long-distance trail, and viewpoints are often where capacity issues are first seen. There are a number of ways of preventing those impacts, a lot of times from trampling over, for example, at a campsite or a viewpoint, like widening the impact, causing erosion. There's a lot of structural ways to work on that. Limiting use is really challenging, particularly in places where you are providing recreation access to a very unique feature. We have that right out the door and up the mountain at Camel's Hump. There's not many Camel's Humps in Vermont, so we can't spread that use. People want to climb to a 4,000-foot mountain and see over the whole New England landscape. And so that's where it gets a lot harder, is where even if you make a parking lot the size that you want the parking lot to be, people are people, and they will expand that use as much as possible. You know, to the extent that, for example, in New Hampshire at Franconia Notch, people were parking in the median of an interstate, which is, like, I think most of us can agree, a very unsafe thing to do. But they were very driven to get to an amazing resource. The Franconia Ridge is a loop above tree line for like over 4 miles. Like, it's awesome, and people really like that. So visitor use management is a very challenging part of recreation management because it involves both significant investment in, like, monetary investment by the land or recreation manager in those structural features that would keep people where you want them to be, including things like ridge runners, like we have on Mount Mansfield and Camel's Hump through Green Mountain Club every year, including good signage, including education campaigns, and including the structural implements, but then also in that behavior change, which is the trickiest of all, as I think we all know.
Yes, yeah, go.
I guess just quickly I'll say there's 2 types of carrying capacity. There's social carrying capacity, which was what Claire was really alluding to, and it's like all about expectations of what you're expecting when you're going out into the trails, and I think that's something we've all experienced in the last couple of years. There's so many more people out on the trails, and the carrying capacity is lower than before. There's also biological carrying capacity, and that's kind of how that's going to impact the wildlife, the plants, the natural communities, and that's going to be a little harder to regulate on trails. And just going down to the next part of that question is, how do we manage for potential growth for volume of users? And you know, a couple of things that we'll probably get into a little bit later, but talking about different zones of recreation, different levels of uses that you're allowed in different areas, regulating maybe the seasonality or the time of day that people are out on the trails is also a way to manage that and meet both the biological and social carrying capacities.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll just mention one other thing about volume of recreation. Like Andrea said, it's not something easily quantifiable, if at all. And generally in recreation ecology, there's an agreed upon threshold relationship with volume of users that Andrea also alluded to earlier, that, you know, once you have a trail somewhere, you can't untrail it. It's sort of a semi-permanent structure. It lives on through people's memories. And the how do I describe this? But the impact of trails is somewhat immediate. It's very close to there was no trail, and there's a trail, and once there's very few users, the impact is high, and it somewhat plateaus. And the nuance and the specifics and the relationship of what happens after that plateau, is there another plateau? You know, is there a point when an area is no longer ecologically functional, essentially like a sacrificial area due to recreation? that is an open question, and one that we're tackling on the greens right now, and potentially trying to come up with a threshold beyond which we wouldn't allow any more trail development. But the impact happens fairly immediately from regular use, and it doesn't have to be a huge volume of people, as is sometimes expected.
Great. Okay, this one's going to be a jump ball question, so just I want to see you. So this is about public access and public involvement. So while recreation can have a negative impact on wildlife, enabling public access to natural spaces promotes a desire to protect and conserve these lands. If we limit public access, do we limit our ability to conserve lands? Who wants to jump on that one?
I can start.
You're going to start there?
I don't think it's an either-or thing, limiting public access and limiting our ability to conserve. I think that question may be a little misworded, because just because we're limiting maybe trails, we're not limiting public access. As you know, Hannah's talking about, there's plenty of ways to recreate on land without having a trail. And so I don't think it's a direct conflict correlation right there. Again, this isn't a really well thought out answer. But I think part of it also goes down to like developing a land ethic, you know, outside of being on the trails, and figuring out how we can all behave well in public areas. And that will, I think, directly kind of correlate into conserving land as well. So that's my half-brained answer.
Andrea doesn't know this, but I'm stealing something that she told me yesterday to answer this question, which is that every acre of land doesn't have to be everything to everyone. And if you're saying that you're limiting public access on that 1 acre of land because you're saying this isn't a good place for a trail, or this is a good place for a trail, that's not thinking about the right scale here. And the scale I think we need to really think about in these decisions is first the landscape scale. Where are the opportunities? Where are the opportunities for getting outside in a quiet way and not being around many other people? Where are the opportunities to go out with your family and have a picnic next to the river? Where are the opportunities for an otter to go from one watershed to another watershed? Where are the opportunities to go out and have, get some serious exercise to clear your head? All of those things need to be available to people and to wildlife within the landscape, and that's what Andrea's talking about with the ecologically functional landscape. In some of those acres, there might be some management decisions that allow one thing or another to protect something else. But overall, we want to make sure that the opportunities exist to be healthy, to drink clean water, to breathe clean air for people, for wildlife, and for natural communities.
I agree. I don't think that this is a mutually exclusive concept, that limiting public access would limit support for conservation. And I think that I see that in our work with Northeast Wilderness Trust, is that, as I described, we do have a more limited program for public access on our lands, but the organization continues to grow and conserve more land and find more supporters, because I think that people really recognize the benefits, the ecological benefits of conservation beyond just being able to recreate in the woods. And I think also it provides, limiting public access in some ways provides really great educational opportunities. I think about seasonal trail closures for peregrines or bobcats, and I think things like that are really good ways for for people to learn and understand what's at play in a forest beyond their own recreational interaction with it. So I think there's just so many ways, I think, to build support for conservation. It's not just about trails and recreation, and I think that people recognize that, especially in the context of climate change. I think people really recognize the importance that an unfragmented, resilient landscape plays in a much bigger context beyond your everyday interaction with it.
You gave me the perfect segue to the next question. Thank you. Okay, climate change. There's a lot of concern about the effect climate change will have on Vermont's forests. How should we manage our community and town forests such that these forests are resilient despite a warming climate? And Andrea, I'm going to let you take that one. I'm giving you all the easy ones.
Really simple questions to answer in 5 minutes. I think by far and large, the best thing we can do to kind of mitigate the impacts of climate change on our landscape is make sure that we have connected, intact forests, keeping the undeveloped areas undeveloped and keeping these landscapes forested. And so what that means kind of on a town forest level is making sure that there is a diversity of structures, there's a diversity of species, different trees and plants that are going to be resilient to different impacts that are coming as a result of climate change. Making sure that there are areas that are, different age classes, areas that are, less managed than other spots, and just keeping these forests as forests is really the biggest thing that we can do. In terms of wildlife, making sure that these forests are connected, both in riparian areas and then on upland areas as well. And I think that's the real simple 5-minute kind of answer that we can talk about. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on climate change.
Climate change done.
That's great. Well done. All right. Problem solved. No. Okay, our next question. We're moving along here pretty good. So other impacts. So it's often been argued that developing trail-based recreation areas is inherently a conservation action because it creates an economically viable alternative to residential or commercial development. So how do you view this argument? And Hannah, I had you tagged to take this one on first. You're welcome.
I'm going to kind of reject the premise of the question a little bit and say that I don't really think about conservation in terms of a strictly economic value. I think there's so much beyond economic value that is a part of conservation. I definitely can see, the argument, trails bring people into communities, they contribute to the local economy. I think that's all definitely true. But I think there are other values to conservation that go beyond economics, like we've been talking about, intact forest, intact ecological processes, things like that. I think, kind of as we're talking about, it's all about a balance. There's not all uses are appropriate for all places. And I think it's about looking at the big picture of a landscape and where certain uses make sense to take place, where they're going to be the least impactful and not contribute to fragmentation or the degradation of a natural ecosystem. But then, of course, balancing that with everything we're saying of the positives for human communities that trails provide.
I would just add that historically and currently, recreation does drive and influence conservation across Vermont and across the country. There are many funding sources that are only available if public access is guaranteed. Proximity to current recreation resources is often raises conservation projects to higher levels for many, particularly public funding sources. Support from recreation groups, support from communities wanting recreation is a huge factor in many conservation decisions. And much of what is currently conserved in Vermont is conserved because of recreation groups and because of the recreation opportunities available on those lands, from Mount Mansfield to Candlesham to the Green Mountain National Forest. And so, again, I also reject the dichotomy, the idea that recreation and conservation are opposed. I think what mainly we've been talking about is actually, like, once something is conserved, how do we manage recreation within that parcel? But how our culture is structured, how historically conservation and recreation have evolved together in the past 100 years. They're very entwined, and much of the resilient landscape we have today is because people have valued the landscape in part for where people can go on it.
Quickly, that I think just talking strictly about trail-based recreation as a way to conserve land is problematic. I think about all of the state land that the Fish and Wildlife Department owns, all of our wildlife management areas, which are paid for by hunters and fishers and trappers, and those are all conserved areas used for recreation, just not necessarily a trail-based system.
Oh, yeah.
I have a short comment to add to, I think, what has been like such a well-covered topic, and want to say that if you have a piece of land, again, the dichotomy, we're running into it over and over again, but it creates an economically viable alternative to residential or commercial development. Another way to think about this question is if you have a piece of land and say, well, it almost feels like saying, as long as it's not those things, it's fine. As long as it's not residential or commercial development, it's a win. And that may be true. And I think that also it's important to take each piece of land. Unfortunately, like, there isn't one solution for all situations. Take each piece of land and look at it as an individual of what's around it, what does the community need, what is on that land, what do we need to do with this piece, and that just operating between, well, it isn't a development, so we're winning, is still doing a disservice to that land, where considering what and where for all of the different variables is still an important process.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here. I'm going to switch things up a little bit because Meredith, you made me think about question number 10. So I'm going to take that, maybe flip it around a little bit, and then we'll move on to the private land one. So this is a question about equity. Access to nature, we were talking about that there's, diversity of approaches to management and everything, but there's also a diversity of approach to how we all interact with the land. So access to nature is not the same for everyone. For example, those who do not own property or have a readily available car may be less likely to spend time in nature. How might we take an equitable approach to conservation in our community forest, even if that means potentially limiting public access? So Meredith, you had indicated that you might want to take this question on earlier.
Sure.
So I'm going to maybe let you have the mic back, and then I'll let all of you weigh in. So.
Yeah, I think equity is an important piece of the puzzle here, and an important consideration of what goes where. Like, that's, I think, what we keep coming back to, and sometimes the analogy that I think of in my mind is about forestry and managed lands, that if you have a managed landscape, you're not going to put the same prescription everywhere because the goals of the landowner are different and what's on the site is different and what can grow there is different. So every place has a different prescription, and equity is an important variable, I think, when it comes to siting trails. And so it's challenging. Like, we're all busy and involved in so many things, and group process is so hard. So even getting through to think about one site and what goes where on one forest is a challenge. But I think if it's possible to step back and think about on a whole town level or county level, which isn't something that happens or that we have the framework for right now, identifying ideal areas where trails would be developed based on equity. Like, where do we not have something that's close to a town center? Where is important based on who might use it to develop trails should be a driving factor for locating them, which I know is complicated by where the land is available, where money is coming from to fund the land, things like that. But yeah, I think it is as important as you know what's on the land, that considering dispersing that access or prioritizing areas that are walkable or things like that.
I was thinking about this question. It was written about people with cars, and there's lots of different ways that things can be unequitable. But thinking specifically in the car context, I think as a community, you really have to take a step back and look at all the different resources that are available for the public. And I think specifically in Richmond here, it's such an amazing place to be a part of the community here. You can't necessarily walk to the Andrewstown Forest. It's not safe, it's not practical. There's not a bus that goes by. So if you don't have a car, you're probably not gonna get there. But if you want to go out and walk in nature, there's a beautiful trail along the river that gets you into different forest blocks, gets you down to the river. So there's lots of different opportunities. Maybe they're not all the same, but there are different opportunities. So maybe not every place has to have the same level of access. And I think about that a lot. Working with the town of Williston, they have a ton of different public properties that have a different range of recreation that's allowed in different places. Not everywhere is a place that you can have your dog run around off leash, but there are those places that you can. And so I just think when we're talking about access and equity, it is important to kind of take a step back and look at all of the resources in the community that are available.
I think the other thing besides what both Andrea and Meredith said about equity is to think about what is actually there. Like, is it a welcoming space that someone can go to and feel safe and feel comfortable? And I think that can mean different things to different people. The only way to find out what those things are is to ask. So whether you're thinking about putting in a trail at a trailhead, or even just thinking about the trailhead and what signage you need, how big of a sign to make it, how clear your instructions for use are at a kiosk, what language they're in. All of those indicate how welcome someone might feel in that place. And I think those are really important considerations to make. Of course, there's the consideration at the planning phase and getting input from community members, but then there's the actual implementation, and I think sometimes we forget that part of the process.
That's great. Thanks so much. And so, Andrea, your comment about the path along the river here is, I think, really an appropriate one for this next question, because that path, while on some public lands, town lands, it also runs down the river and crosses in these private lands as well. So the next question is about private land. Much of Vermont is privately owned. and how much trail development on private land how is trail development on private land regulated, and what resources do landowners have to implement a low-impact, conservation-oriented trail?
Well, as far as I know, it's up to the landowner's prerogative, however they want to maintain the trails on their property. There's no regulations outside of, water quality violations, I believe, that are really regulating private land trails, which is great for private landowners. They can do what they want. But if they are interested in having a low impact conservation-oriented trail, there are several resources available. I'm one of them. Other biologists in our department are also available to come out and walk properties and help identify areas that are, where trails would be beneficial. I think county foresters and consulting foresters are also great resources. If you have one of those on your property, they can help identify where maybe forest roads and logging trails would go, and you can create a much lower impact if you are doubling up trail use on those situations. There's also a number of resources. I know New Hampshire has a trail kind of model, I guess for lack of a better word, that can help define where trails are. I'm trying to think of other good examples. You guys might have other things that come out.
Just to throw out a couple of FPR's resources, I also am a resource. But we're also working with the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council on more guidelines for best management practices. There's a lot of trail guidelines out there. There are a lot of really great trails organizations as well, nonprofits in a lot of communities, a lot of land trusts, a lot of people eager to help private landowners make really great decisions.
Thank you. Okay, we are down to our last couple of questions here. We're doing great. So now we're getting into sort of, I think these are a couple of questions that are really synthesizing a lot of interest here in the community around our own town forest. So it's no secret in the room that the Andrews Forest has been the subject of a lot of conversation around how we place trails, et cetera. So I think what folks are looking for in this next one is your thoughts on, are there conserved forests in Vermont and beyond that exemplify low-impact recreation? Can you highlight some of them and describe what makes them models for striking this balance between conservation and recreation? So who wants to jump on that one? Hannah, do you want to take a stab at that?
I can just provide a direct example of one of the Wilderness Trust's preserves that I think does a good job of this with some caveats. A lot of the properties that I work with and manage have the benefit of being very large, hundreds or even thousands of acres. So that provides a lot more of a buffer for trails. But we have a preserve in Maine. It's our largest preserve. It's the Alder Stream Wilderness Preserve. And it has some established trails on it, but kind of like I was talking about before, the trails are concentrated in small areas. There's not a huge crisscrossing network of trails. A lot of them utilize old logging roads or abandoned town roads, so corridors that have already been impacted and exist there rather than creating new trail. And then those trails avoid some of the most sensitive natural communities. There's a really important wetland complex. The trails stay away from any really wet areas, some of the significant natural communities that have been identified on the property. And then a large majority of the property is left trailless, but still open to the public. And so that allows for some of that more dispersed recreation. We really encourage that as sort of a slower, more contemplative, connective form of recreation, so to speak, for people to connect with the land, maybe focus a little more on, nature observation, bird watching, things of that sort that you might not be able to do as well on a busy traveled trail. So I think about that preserve as a good example of a balance of access. It's in a really rural community, and so people appreciate that the trails are there as a resource, but then it's also really fulfilling an important role for the natural landscape in that area as well.
Another really great example that's local and a very similar community is the Huntington Town Forest. The Heinsberg Town Forest. Huntington is also great. They're working on their plan, but I meant to highlight Heinsberg. The Heinsberg Town Forest is great. They have an amazing conservation commission that has been working for a long time developing their forest management plan, and kind of what makes their forest such a great example is that they have different zones of recreation. It's a heavily trailed forest with lots of biking, lots of running trails, but it's also a birding hotspot. There's hunting that goes on. I've done a lot of squirrel hunting out there. It's great. But what we've done is they've identified different zones of disturbance, essentially. So they have 3 different levels in that forest where kind of the recreation is consolidated into these different levels. And it's just a really great example of kind of coming together, different user groups, and having a really nice forest. I know the Wolcott Town Forest is a little bit of a different situation, a very different community, but they are going through their forest management planning right now. They have a large 800-acre block that they're working with the Trust for Public Land on, and kind of going through a lot of the same conversations that we're having right here. If there's several different examples throughout the state that if the Town Forest Committee is interested, that we can connect with.
All right, so our last question sort of builds on that, which is if you were designing a trail system in a town forest that was acquired through a conservation easement and would serve as a model trail design across Vermont, how would you decide where to place those trails? Is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or does this need to be done on a forest-by-forest basis?
I think the second question should be easy for all of you by now, considering all of our answers to the rest of the questions, which is it definitely has to be considered in context and therefore on a case-by-case basis. For the first question, I think, again, you want to look at the system in scales. You want to see it from a landscape scale. We have a lot of resources. We have Vermont Conservation Design, we have TNC's Resilient Landscapes, to look at how does this parcel relate to other parts of the state, ecologically and socially. We have the A&R Atlas, which is a really, really great resource. If you haven't looked at it, it's really fun. You can look at the parcel that you live on and how it relates to other things around you, or the parcel that you're looking at conserving. There's fish and wildlife resources, there's FPR resources, including other trails in the area. So you want to look and see what the context is in the landscape. You want to look at the natural communities scale or the habitat scale. See if there's any sensitive plant communities, wildlife communities, specific habitat needs, like a cliff where peregrine falcons might nest, for example. Then you want to look at a very site-specific scale, very small features that might be wet in the spring, a seep that might be wet in the spring, maybe not quite a vernal pool, but if it's wet, you might want to avoid it. Those are all the physical realities that you want to look at. But of course, you also want to look at why was the parcel conserved? If it's a town forest owned by the town, it should represent the values of the town. How can you find out what those values are? How can you create a governance structure that's fair for making the decisions? Because I'm sure you all know this by now. It's very difficult to make decisions that every single person in a town is happy about. So you have to create that process, hopefully before you start making decisions. And you take all of that information, take all the physical realities of the place, and you take the social realities of your town, you put them all together, and you make a plan, and you decide where and if you want trails in that parcel. And then the next year, using adaptive management, we always recommend, is this working? Of course, it is hard to close down trails, but it isn't impossible. If there is a trail through a wet area that you didn't realize, you can relocate. You can change how that trail is located on the landscape. You never want to say, we're done, it's over. You always want to look at, is this still fulfilling the needs of the community, or are there ways that we can improve it?
I think Claire did an amazing job summarizing that. That was a lot of the things that I was going to say. I think I'll clarify one of the places you were going with the landscape view, and clarify, say, prioritizing landscape features like connectivity and interior forest blocks as a high priority to retain as such, and not fragment. And then I think that I will only add one thing, because you said everything so well, that if I were to be doing this exercise hypothetically, I would really focus on the consolidation of trails and the leaving of trail-free area, if it made sense, if it was large enough block, especially if it was connected to other areas. But as one principle to take, consolidating trails, not to the point of the expense of the trail experience, of wiggling back and forth to where you don't feel like you're alone in the woods ever, but keeping a small area to where trails exist. And like Hannah has said as well, that they do it in New England Trust, or Wilderness Trust, leaving trail-free areas also.
I'll just mention a couple more fine points when you're talking about where you're going to put a trail on a generic landscape, and one of them is you look at kind of an edge, or like where two habitats are meeting. And so if you're going to put a trail through an area, it's much better for wildlife to not put it through the middle of a nice grassy field. That's where your grassland birds are going to be, and a trail, and the bikers or hikers and dogs are going to disturb those. So put a trail on the edge of that grassland. Put a trail on the edge of the forest, not through it. If there's a feature like a really cool heron rookery or a bald eagle nest or something that people are going to be interested in looking, develop your trail system so it funnels people to a place where they can see that from a good distance, so it's not disturbing it, and then they can back out. People are people. They're gonna try to see the interesting things, and so you want to make sure that you can guide them that way. A lot of times we talk, river trails. We just mentioned the river trail here, and it's beautiful to walk along water, but we know that is a crucial place for many, many animals to move back and forth in the forest and in the wild. And so if you have a river or a stream, it's really beneficial to maybe don't make your trail follow that area. Have one intersection where people can get down to the water, experience that, and move on. Don't have a trail that runs the length of that stream. Trying to think of some other things, but those are the couple details that just jumped out at me right now.
All right, thank you. Those were great answers to these questions. And so I'm sure all of you, this has stimulated more questions. And so we're going to take a 5-minute break to get us back on time. And then we will take questions from the audience and from our participants watching on Zoom. And Daniel, are you going to help me do that?
Could you just let them know on Zoom to write their questions in the chat?
Absolutely. So for folks on Zoom, there's a chat feature in there. Write your questions in the chat box, and Daniel will be monitoring that, and we will take your questions, and we will alternate between the live bodies here in the Richmond Library and the Zoom bodies out there in the world. So 5 minutes, folks. All right, before we start the questions, thank you so much for that conversation for the last hour. It was really informative. I know I picked a couple tidbits, so yeah, thank you. Yes. Here comes the dynamic part. We're going to start taking questions from the audience, and I'll start with the folks in the room here. And the easiest way to do this is just raise your hand, and we'll try to take those in order that I see the hands going up, and I will do my best to keep the order in mind. But we're going to alternate between Zoom. So, yes?
Can you make sure you repeat the question?
I will. Thank you for the reminder. Yes. Chi-Chi, your hand went up first.
I have a question that it's not specifically about recreation, but it does relate to question 7 about climate change and managing the forests. So my question is, for land that's enrolled in the current use program, it requires logging every 10 years, which is a major disturber of the forest. So do you have any information about if the state is becoming aware of the value of just leaving forest land to sequester carbon and to provide undisturbed habitat rather than requiring logging every 10 years?
Okay. Great.
Categories in current use right now that you can manage under the current use guidelines for specifically for wildlife and for other ecological sensitive areas. But that being said, there's a lot of benefit to actively managing your forest, and that plays into climate change as well. Having a resilient forest is part of that means having a diversity of age classes, a diversity of age of structures in the forest. And right now in our landscape, we have a lack of that diversity. Our agency is actively working on a thing called Vermont Conservation Design, where we have different targets for different age groups of forests to meet more pre-settlement kind of targets. And that includes old forests, but it also includes young forests as well. And so I think if we really are going to address climate change, we need to have that diversity.
As someone who's responsible for the current use enrollments of Northeast Wilderness Trust lands, I can speak a little more specifically to that as a landowner representative. There is a category of current use called the conservation category that land trusts are able to enroll land in, and that's what we do at Northeast Wilderness Trust because we don't do any active forest management on our lands. We take the approach of aiming towards future old growth through totally natural processes, which is on a longer time scale than we typically think about. But again, as I said, that's a necessary niche on the landscape, and isn't to say that thoughtful forest management isn't also a really important approach and tool on the landscape as well. I don't know a ton about this, but I have heard a little bit about potentially For private landowners, a similar category, opening up where land can be sort of put in that unmanaged or reserve category, where timber management isn't required. I don't know a ton about the specifics of that, but I know that that's something that's being talked about.
And I have just a little bit to add to that, which I believe my understanding is that for the current use program, you do need an updated management plan every 10 years, but I don't believe you need to have a forest entry every 10 years, do you? Right, so I don't think you have to go in. You do need to have your land reassessed and your forester continue to keep an eye on what's going on and give recommendations. But and then the other piece related to climate change, forest openings done thoughtfully, like we've talked about, are incredible for wildlife. They're also really important for pollinators and pollinator habitat, the plants that they rely on, which is an incredible element of sort of supporting our world through the changing climate.
No.
Okay, I can just ask it. Then
Please. Yeah, that way we don't have to do it.
Hi, I'm the public on Zoom. This question is around hedgerows, and we actually placement, not going through a forest or through a meadow. But we also know that hedgerows can be really important ecological systems and often offer corridors or places of travel, or just those intermediate zones can be really important. So just wanted to think about the benefits of preserving hedgerows, especially on a larger scale. And we can think about that in terms of recreation too, and kind of, so where do we put this trail, or how do we manage that? But maybe thinking about how do we consider hedgerows or those in-between ecosystem spaces when we're looking at management.
Who wants to take on hedgerows?
I mean, I guess that was a comment that I started with. Well, I guess first we could probably start with talking about context. Probably not all hedgerows are equal, so we can't speak in generalities. But I mean, a hedgerow when I have a picture of a hedgerow in my mind, that is like a long, skinny kind of vegetated area. What I had mentioned earlier was an edge between two habitats, so like where a field and a forest would meet. So that's what an edge. Hedgerows are very important connectivity pieces for animals like bobcat, rabbits, small mammals, things like that. They're also really important for pollinators. They're huge connectivity corridors for pollinators if you think about things at that level. So I think if you are putting a trail along a hedgerow, yeah, I don't know. I think that's a very contextual, detailed question, I guess.
Yeah, I think that this just put me in mind of some of the things that trail designers think about when they're out in the woods. And we have general guidelines for avoiding sensitive habitats, but like when I think of a hedgerow or more of a natural hedgerow, like a thicket, that can create a visual and sound barrier between a potential trail and a sensitive ecosystem. And so you could potentially sneak a trail in with low impact if there is like a thicket of spruce fir, for example, or other lower shrub-like vegetation. And so I think when we're thinking about, like I've said, I think at least 5 times tonight, when you're thinking about the landscape scale, there's things to think about, natural communities, and then on the ground, it's the most fun, and you can really think about how you reduce your impact, both with good trail design, reducing erosion, but also your impact on the natural ecosystem, thinking about cool landscape features that might block some of the impact from a bigger area.
Thanks. I thought your hand? Yeah.
Chris, I just wonder, does the state have a sensitive species list that everyone can look at? Or just off the top of your heads, in Richmond, what are the sensitive species, sensitive ecotypes that people here should hear about?
Great question, Chris. So the question for folks out there is, does the state have a list of sensitive species? And particularly, is there one for Richmond? So
yes, we do have a list of sensitive species. It's available on our Fish and Wildlife website. You could probably just Google Vermont sensitive species and it would get you there. I don't particularly know one right off the top of my head for Richmond, but that can be developed by looking at the ANR Atlas, what Claire was mentioning earlier, and also just kind of extrapolating some, or talking to a biologist would be able to help you. Off the top of my head, I know like bats here, there's some sensitive bats, there's some sensitive bird species. I don't know, do you guys have anything else on how to generate?
Just sensitive natural communities.
Oh yeah, and sensitive natural communities, which are also listed on the ANR Atlas. So. Just contact Fish and Wildlife will help you.
Yeah.
You can take another one
From the public? Okay. Richard?
So a comment and a question. First, active management, I'll just pick with the term because to me, when you make a conservation decision, that's active management. You're making a decision. So call it what it is. If it's logging, it's logging. But active management to me is a human intentional decision around a forest. So that active thing doesn't work for me. On the question that I want to ask is how do we reconcile, and there are some landowners that couldn't be here that I was talking to, and the problem that they're facing is very specific. It's a little bit of a landmine. It's mountain biking and trails cutting across their land. Sometimes they'll see maps. They never saw the map. They never had anything to do with the map, and the map shows a trail going across their land. And I'm just wondering, how can we get in a better situation in terms of managing that dynamic? Because none of those landowners want to see an end to mountain biking. Some of them even enjoy it, some of them just see it as an economic valuable activity. But there's a problem, and the question is how to reconcile that.
Great question. So first the comment was active management. There's a spectrum of active management. It's any decision that you're making around the land, whether you're even doing passive management, where you're not touching, that's still an active decision that a landowner makes, including going all the way across to developing that land is also an active management decision. The question was, on private lands where there may be trails that have been put on those private lands, they then show up as on a public mapping tool or on a map that shows where great trails are. And how do we manage that? Is there some way to sort of, because it's a tension point that then, impacts all the trails. So who wants to take that one?
I think that there are best management practices for all aspects of recreation management. And the first step to the best management practices is landowner permission. I think pretty much can universally agree about that. However, people are really excited, and sometimes they don't realize what they're doing. Sometimes they just think they can get away with it. I just want to point out there's a lot of groups working on this on private lands and public lands on making sure people understand what landowner rights are and how important private land access for recreation, whether it's hunting and fishing or trail-based recreation is in Vermont. We have really great laws that protect landowners and allow public access on many of our private lands. But the responsibility that comes with that privilege that we all have is respecting the rights of the private landowner. And the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council for mountain biking, the Vermont Mountain Bike Association is working with their trail clubs, figuring out who the people are who are either making a mistake, sometimes it's a fair mistake that they didn't realize they crossed the property line. We all know property lines aren't always so well marked. And figuring out how to fix those situations and stop them from happening in the first place. You guys want?
I feel like I have a follow-up question as the moderator. So yes to everything you said, but there's also, there's a number of like apps out there now where trails show up on those apps. And do you know, are there ways to communicate with the developers of those apps or the promoters of those maps to say, this trail should not be showing up on your resource?
All trail apps are not created equal. Some trail apps are profit-based companies and are nationwide. And what we really learned from the surge of interest in recreation from COVID is that people look at those apps. And there's been some studies in the Adirondacks and coming over to Vermont and New Hampshire about trying to find out how people are learning about recreation opportunities, because then we can meet them where they're learning, where they are. And a lot of new people, a lot of the new recreationists who hadn't ever been to the Adirondacks before found it on an app. Luckily, many of the apps are responding and now allowing land managers to edit the postings. This is really great. This is a really great update. It's still a little tricky. Please take the information with a grain of salt. Other things like Strava, if you've looked at the Strava heat map, what that is Strava is an app that people can carry around, and it will track your ride or your run or your ski. And the heat map puts together all those people's places where they went. And then you can look online, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of fun. But you also see where people are going on places maybe they shouldn't be going. And some of those might be trails that people have created, and some of it might be not trailed and actually legal, like it's a legal access of private land, but then it becomes on this map that is available to the public. So as users, I want to caution all of you to take all that information, knowing that it's coming from other people of the public who might have just gone the wrong way on, like water bars. Looks like a trail, and then you realize you're not on the trail anymore and you gotta go back. Like, that gets recorded on the app, and if you look too closely at it, you might follow those same mistakes. I want to put a little plug. The Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation supports trailfinder.info. Trailfinder has always been a website that works with trail managers first and only posts information that the trail manager approves. Some of that information might be a little old, needs to be updated, but we know at least at some point the trail manager, so usually that means there might be more trails than is available on the website, but we use that for state lands trails updates. For example, during mud season when we have to close trails for resource protection, we post that information on Trailfinder. So check it out if you're interested.
Thank you. That was really helpful information. Daniel, you're up, and then we'll take your question.
This question is about cars and recreation. So the question was, if we didn't have cars, would we need recreation trails? But I think another way we might say that and relate that to this conversation is about how do we minimize car use in terms of building out sort of those trail networks and increase accessibility while also minimizing our carbon impact.
You're not touching that? Great, Meredith. Thank you. Clarity.
I don't have a complete or perfect answer, but I think what we touched on earlier of if you're going to develop a new trail system, and have some options focusing on developing it in a walkable area, or if you have some funds for your town, seeing where you could develop a town trail like the one that leaves out of town in Richmond. And this is, I wonder about this from a trail manager perspective, but I've wondered about making more trailheads for a trail system, and if that is a way to reduce car use. If someone's over on one side of the forest, they would have to drive all the way over to, around a mountain and back to get to the trailhead. Does making other trailheads, I don't know if that is a viable solution, but is one that I've thought of as a way to minimize car use and provide more access to what already exists rather than building more and more and more systems.
Yeah, I think, Meredith, that's a really good point of one way it's like a hub and spoke recreation management tool where you spread out the impact of the parking across multiple trailheads. That can work really well, especially in communities with connected trails. I just want to take part of that question, which is, why do we need recreation? I would argue it's not just because we have trails, just because we have cars, but that's part of it. Recreation as a concept really started as we industrialized the world, and fewer and fewer people were working outdoors in a subsistence way, moving towards factory work, office work. I don't think that has reduced. I say that facetiously. I know it hasn't reduced, it has gone up. So I don't think eliminating cars from our world eliminates the need for people to get outside and the health benefits and the social benefits of getting outside, breathing fresh air, exercising, and having outdoor spaces that are safe for the public to access. That's not going to go away.
Thanks, and I might add, it also speaks to the need for public transportation that actually puts people where there are trailheads, which is a crying need in our state. So, hand was in the back, and then we'll take the ones here and then that one. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I'll repeat your question if that's all right.
Okay. My name is Pete Harberton. I want to thank Andrea for pointing out the Heinsberg Town Forest, because I think that is a good model for Richmond. I mean, I've walked it many times. It's a well-structured forest, has many different elevations and inclines. It affords mountain biking, ATVs, hunting, dog controls. It's a good model. So thank you for pointing that out. My real question is, in the perspective of the panel, because I'm a certified trail designer, and everything that you've talked about is in many manuals. It's already out there. And so I want to make that sure that the audience knows that all that has been said is documented. And if you're a certified trail designer, you know these attributes and what you should and shouldn't do. And so I hope that Richmond takes that into consideration. So let me circle back to my question. Do you believe trails should be made based on science or opinion?
Wow, so first, Heinsberg Town Forest, good model for us to be thinking about here in Richmond. Second, certified trail designers have access to this information. And so the question is do we design trails based on science, or do we use public opinion?
Yes.
Meredith.
Both. I can go into more detail, but I think that everything that we've said tonight, and it sounds like probably your experience as a trail builder as well, being familiar with those guidelines that some of which are probably scientifically informed. It's both. It's like it's yes and over and over and over again. I think that keeping in mind the goals for the area, which are often defined by a town's identity or priorities, or hopefully the town is involved in those goals for an area. It's more often than not, natural resource protection is outlined as one of many goals. I think many forests, public forests, if not all public forests in Vermont, are lands of multiple uses, and so along with that, opinion has a seat at the table, public opinion, and science does as well if protection of natural resources is part of the goal for that piece of land.
Great. Thank you. So Laura, and then we'll go with Brad. And then we're 5 minutes left here, so go ahead, Laura.
Okay, so this kind of dovetails with your work, Pete's work, and
just stand up, so
I guess my question is, how much resiliency do you build into considering where to put your trails? Like, you have a semi-permanent trail, but is it really permanent, or do you give some leeway so that you can move the trail a little bit from time to time to allow for resiliency in soil organisms and plant communities, for things to recover a little bit? Do you know, like how you allow a river to meander in the right of way, do you also do that in trail design? I didn't realize there's a whole deal that way. You just have to employ the right trail designer when you're putting your trails down, but I know that Richmond is considering a trail system in Andrews Forest, but Moncton is considering a town forest, and I'm sure many other towns are up against this as well. I'm just curious for the more practical trail design.
So this is so I'm going to repeat the question, and then I'll let you have it, Claire. So the question is, as we lay out trails, they can be semi-permanent, and so how do we sort of think about the ability to sort of allow them to move across that corridor as impacts are felt or appear? And so how do we kind of think about that in our trail design?
So I forget what kind of curve Meredith described. It's not a bell, because a bell would be like that, but that kind of
Exponential. Not exponential, but
a plateau.
Immediate increase with the plateau, yeah.
The immediate increase with the plateau curve of the impact of wildlife also applies to impact of soil. So the first 10 people who walk down the trail have the most impact, and then it pretty much levels off. And so generally we want people to stay on the trail, because that has been impacted, and that is the hopefully sustainably designed trail that won't erode, and that is where we want people to go. Trails are people management tools to reduce impact on a forest. Think if the thousands of people who climbed Camel's Hump didn't have a trail to follow. Think of like how wide the impact of that would be versus on trails. Of course, we are now like in a multi-year project to harden the Burroughs Trail to protect that trail because of the unsustainable design of the trail. But I just will say that the idea that we'd want then to move the trail a little bit and move the trail a little bit actually widens that impact. Of course, as I mentioned, if there is a problem on the trail, there are remediations that we can use to restore that area as best as we can. But impacts, recreation ecology shows impacts from compaction for quite a long time after that use. And so we really want to get it right the first time and make small changes after that. Anyone?
Thanks for everybody's expertise. I kind of want to go back to question 1, because I'm confused by the definitions that we have arrived at. Public access recreation is an acceptable purpose for conservation in Vermont state statute. So here we are the entirety of this conversation is kind of like pitting conservation against recreation and saying, like, is conservation compatible with recreation? How does recreation impact conservation? But by Vermont state statute, conservation, like recreation and conservation are the same. So I'm wondering if, as a side note, I'm sad that this conversation isn't about how recreation and conservation can support each other. It's a subtle difference, but I feel like it would have really contributed to harmony in our town and to encouraging people to come together instead of continuing to divide people who believe they're conservationists and recreationists when many of us are the same people. So I'm wondering if we can return to that definition, because I think for the long-term health of this town, it might be useful to think about, like, are we talking about preservation and conservation? Like, is there a difference there? Or if in Vermont state statute, conservation includes recreation, then I'm just confused by kind of the segmentation. And again, I'm not arguing, and I don't believe that there should be recreation on all lands. I'm a supporter of Northeast Wilderness Trust. I firmly believe that there should be land where there are not people on it. But I'm just trying to understand, like, how do you more clearly frame the conversation?
Thank you. All right, so the question was basically, let's go back to the beginning, and that the sort of the dialectic that was set out there of recreation being in conflict with conservation maybe is false, and that in our own statutes in Vermont, recreation is considered a part of the conservation activity. And so further reflection from our panel is asked to, how do we think about that to avoid that sort of setting up that unnecessary conflict when there's probably 95% agreement and then the little tweaks along the edges. I editorialized a little bit there. So who wants to take another stab at question number one? Or
I'll say a couple things, but I imagine other folks can contribute as well and want to say, I think you're absolutely right. I want to apologize for not making that clear on my behalf. I think that in all of this work, that's been my goal. Say, how do these things coexist? How do we know more to be better? How do we know more to be more thoughtful? Because they do coexist, and I think the deep inquiry that we get into these nitpicky questions of, like, okay, the volume and the types of recreation, and where do we put it in the hedgerows and all the things, and I think that at the bottom of that, the reason for doing that is so that we can stand behind our decisions about what we do with recreation and say that, you know, maybe we have this land in the first place because of the recreation interests that could have funded it, but we can stand behind the decisions that we made around what to do on this piece of land, knowing that we did it really well. I had someone in a presentation ask me one time, like, oh, if I'm on a trail, should I, like, make sure I'm quiet so that, no, like, the goal is that you can fully enjoy the trail, hopefully, and not have any of these things in the back of your mind because you know that your town and your community has brought those two together to fully, like, consider the thoughtfulness of how to put trails somewhere so that there isn't a question of, like, is this getting in the way of conservation, because it's not. They were considered alongside each other.
Yeah, I think I would reiterate Meredith's apology, because I think maybe the panel skipped over the belief that we share with you, that you shared, that these are not dichotomous things, that we are balancing many different uses of land, that we are always working to find the best way to provide the most benefit to the most people and animals and plants. And recreation in statute is a reason for conservation. It's part of the conservation landscape. But because it is part, it's not the whole. If it was the whole, it would be easy. We'd just build trails everywhere. But it's part. And so what I think we skipped over was like that acknowledgement that is an important part, but that we have to figure out how all those parts work together. And I think that's probably what we focused on today. But I will acknowledge that how important it is to that whole.
I mean, I guess I would say that I'm sorry that you felt that this was more divisive than informative. And I think we were very clear that it's very nuanced and there's no one answer. Recreation has a lot of different forms. Conservation has a lot of different forms. And I think our landscape has room for all of it. But, I think we were up here to ask, I know I was asked to come up and talk about wildlife impacts of recreation. And I feel like that's what we did. I wasn't trying to vilify anything. I'm sorry that you felt like this was a divisive conversation. I thought it was really informative and great. So.
Great. So we're at time, and the library actually closes 10 minutes ago. So we're gonna have to shut it down. Thank you. I think what I learned really quick, just what everybody said. There's a lot of nuance to all of this, and I think we just all need to sort of, as we go through these, think carefully about what those impacts are on site, and that there's a range of values as well as science that needs to go into all of our decision making. So as I say that, I want to thank all of you for coming to Richmond and sharing your expertise. It's awesome, and then I'm going to give it over to Daniel for one last announcement, and then we can all go on our merry way.
Just a plug for the Andrews Community Forest Committee. They're holding a public engagement event on March 29th to talk specifically about the management plan. So if you're interested in the detailed nuts and bolts about that, please attend. March 29th, 5:45 at Camel's Hump Middle School. So just putting in a plug. There's more on the ACFC website as well if you want to learn more. But thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.